Right, right. And I know when I first came into counseling, I wanted my counselor to hand me a list.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what you have to accomplish before you're going to feel better.
That's right.
The recovery to-do list.
And they would say, it doesn't work that way.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. We are with you today with our usual host, Dr. Greg Miller, and with special guest from our staff here at Faithful and True. Susie Smidt is one of our group leaders and individual counselors. She and her husband Russ also counsel couples. She does it all. So Susie has agreed to join us today. She wrote a feature article for our newsletter in the month of January, and we've gotten very positive feedback from that. So we thought it would be great to have Susie on the podcast to talk more about this. And it's based around my work and what does that even mean? So Susie, we're going to turn it over to you and let you jumpstart the podcast with what that really means.
Yeah. And
Thank
Susie,
you,
thanks
Randy.
for taking time to be with us. That's great.
You're welcome. It's good to be here. It was one day after one of the groups that I led, and the women seemed kind of befuddled, and where were they at in direction, and maybe a little discouraged. And, in counseling, we talk a lot about our work, and it just inspired me to sit down and start putting down some bullet points of what examples, right, of what our work
What does that work
is.
really mean?
Yeah, what does that even mean?
And I remember even in my own journey, when I started this, I was a part of a counseling center. I'm in the Chicago area, and I would hear the other clients talk about doing their work. I would hear the therapist encouraging us and inviting us to do our work. And like most people, I wasn't sure exactly what that meant. And so when this topic came up as a possible newsletter article and you volunteered to write it, I thought that this was a great idea, because sometimes we speak language that we are used to, but someone new may not fully understand what we're talking about.
Right. And I know when I first came into counseling, I wanted my counselor to hand me a list.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what you have to accomplish before you're going to feel better.
That's right.
The recovery to-do list.
And they would say, it doesn't work that way. So it can be hard to define.
Yeah. So what do you see as some of the things that you would say are a part of doing our work?
Well, this is a page of bullet points that Aaron's going to attach to this podcast in a link, right?
Yes.
We'll just hit a few of these. The first one I put down here is just figuring out even how to identify feelings. That seems so basic, and it is surprisingly difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next step to that is, what needs do I identify as a result of those feelings? That sounds simple, right? And we know that it's not.
Right. And one of the things I would add, and I often have conversations with men about this, that it's not just identifying the feelings, you also begin to be able to express the emotions. A lot of times we're in our recovery, we're good at naming, I'm sad, or I'm hurt, or I'm angry, but they're just a word that I use. I can identify them, but I don't have access to my anger or my sadness or my grief yet. So part of the work, maybe the first step is, like you've said, identifying it. And then the next step would be allowing myself to have access to it and be able to experience it and express it in community and with others.
Yeah. Very, very true. Very true. And in that, the idea of having kindness and grace towards myself in wherever I'm at.
Mm-hmm.
It can easy to be frustrated or, have that internal dialogue that goes along that, I can't get this, or, that's a piece of our work, right? Is learning that kindness towards ourselves.
Well, in part of what I saw in myself and working with others is one of my protection strategies, and one of the things I see in others is when we start getting too close to the emotions, we unconsciously shut down so that we don't have access to them. And so I work with a lot of men that are kind of moving towards them, they're getting closer, but it's almost like as soon as they get too close, they have this involuntary reaction to shut down and not have access to it. So it's not going to be a simple approach. It's kind of moving towards it. And like you've said, have grace with myself. If I do find myself getting closer to my sadness, but then shutting down and not having access to it, it may take a while to be able to move past that, because part of what's true is I have to feel safe enough that I can express the emotions or experience the emotions that for years were unsafe.
Sure, sure. And in emotions, that moves me right into grieving.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the time when we're coming into counseling, we're grieving something, usually a number of things. And so, how how to grieve well, right? How to accept the fact that I have to grieve when I don't
Mm-hmm.
want to often. How to accept that the stages feel kind of chaotic. Uh, Understanding the whole grieving journey and the fact that it can actually lead to serenity and peace eventually.
Yeah. One of the things I encourage men to do is if they're curious about grief and their faith is important to them, just kind of do a word search or a study in the scripture on how much grief is mentioned and how intentional the people were called to grieve. That there
Hmm.
was a process, there was a cultural expression of grief. There were things that you did to acknowledge your grief. And so part of it is recognizing that we have to be intentional in our grief, and to actually have markers could be very helpful to give us access to that grief. There
Hmm.
was a time when you literally wore your grief by wearing black clothing. It was the mark of grief. And so in a season, you might wear total black so that anyone who saw you, they didn't know your story, they didn't know what you were experiencing, but they knew you were grieving because you were literally wearing your grief. We've
Hmm.
gotten to the point where we, as a culture, have sanitized our grief and kind of disconnected from it. So I think to be intentional to move towards it, one is counterintuitive, but it's also countercultural. And we have to hear that invitation. And that is part of our work, to hear that invitation towards grief and to move towards it.
Hmm.
The podcast that Beth and I did recently was on the various types of losses that we've experienced that allow us to
Hmm.
grieve more comprehensively.
Right. And one of the practical ways I lead women into this is to have them just open a page in their journal and begin to list out the losses that they're
Mm-hmm.
feeling. And usually once they get started, that can turn into a pretty extensive list. And then what feelings are coming up for you as you go through the bullet points, reading all of those, and let yourself feel the feelings, and begin there. I think Beth's book, What Loss Can Teach Us, is also a
Mm-hmm.
terrific help in how to grieve.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go on to another one here. I'm learning to apply both and thinking to conflicting realities. That's a tricky one, right? We have the
Yes, it is.
ampersand all over the office. It's in our logo, right, Randy?
Yep.
And, this idea of these conflicting realities of, for the wives I work with, my husband loves me and he betrayed me. That's a difficult one. And if we put, but he loves me, but he betrayed me, then one side or the other becomes true and the other becomes false. And so I think that's such a big one. We could talk about that the entire time here.
Mhm.
But
Absolutely.
to try to figure out how to hold those two things is challenging.
Well, and part of what makes it difficult is many of us grew up in families and systems that really emphasize either or. You're either good or bad, you're either
Black or
right or
white.
wrong, you're either in or out. And so, in that either or thinking, my husband either loves me or he betrays me, but he can't have both. And
Mm,
anytime we're in that either or thinking, it's an attempt to create safety. And so if somebody is either all good or all bad, then my decision is very easy. Either they're all good and I stay with them, or they are all bad and I leave them. But it's in that grayness, it's in that andness that there's so much complexity that it really is challenging for us to know how to move towards it.
hmm And I find many wives I work with, they don't want to leave necessarily. They don't know if they want to leave. I'll say that.
Right.
Um, and so as difficult as the ampersand both and can be, it also opens up a lot of freedom to clients that they can navigate that and take the time they need to put those conflicting things together and make a good decision.
Yeah. Well, maybe a way to say it is when women come to the center, it's not that they want to leave, it's that they don't know how to stay. And in their
Yeah.
current thinking, staying doesn't seem like a viable option. But the andness, the ampersand thinking, the allowing us to see I can be loved and I can be betrayed, it at least opens the door a little bit that I can consider the possibility of staying in the relationship as I get more information about
Mhm.
whether or not my husband's going to choose his own recovery.
Mhm. Okay, next one. I'm going to choose another one here. I'm learning to ask, what can I learn from this, along with all the why me questions. When we have painful times, we naturally ask, why me? Why
Hmm.
is this happening to me? Um, this one maybe isn't, well, not maybe. I wasn't ready for this one for a while. Like, I think it's okay to ask why me for a while, right?
Absolutely.
And eventually to begin gently opening my mind to the fact that there really was a lot of things I could learn from it.
Right. And we know a lot of women who have been significantly hurt because they were pushed too quickly to try to learn from the experience, or especially in the context of the church, what is it that God is wanting to teach you through this, or being reminded that good comes from everything, that all things work for the good. And
Right,
so
right.
I love that you said that it's about timing and having the space to allow yourself to just hurt and be sad and experience the pain of it, and when it's appropriate in time, when you're open to it, to see what is being shaped and formed in you through the
hmm
experience.
Yes, and we get to take all the time we need, right, Greg, to
Yes,
figure those things out.
absolutely.
I'm discovering false core beliefs I didn't realize I had and starting to work on changing them. That's a tricky one because oftentimes, right, our false core beliefs actually feel truer than the truth feels.
Exactly.
And so we have to, again, take our time, be gentle with ourselves. But, as we um, come into this and we begin to be aware more of saying things to ourselves that we, in our brain, know aren't true, but in our reality feel so true. And
Absolutely.
the
Well,
craziness of that.
and what makes the negative core beliefs so strong is that we learn them through experiences and through our interpretation of experiences. We often say that experience is the strongest teacher. So whatever we've learned through experience, we hold on to as if it is the truth, even if it's false. And so just cognitively telling myself that it's different, or I'm not thinking clearly, that's the beginning place, but that's not nearly enough. I need new experiences that I can start to learn new ways to see myself in positive core beliefs. But if I'm not even aware of what my core beliefs are, it's difficult to change something that is operating outside of my awareness.
Here's where group, I think, is for me. It was this showed up a lot in group because
Mhm.
there were things I would say out loud, and my group members would contradict. And a lot of times they were, and I see it in group now as I lead groups, that people will say negative, maybe discouraging things about themselves that the other members of group who know and care about them can contradict,
Right,
can speak truth, and can say, that's not true of you.
right. Well, and even to
Um,
be able to say, you know what, that's not how I experience you. You
yes.
know, when a person is going into their shame, I'm an idiot, I'm stupid, I can't do anything right. For someone just to be able to remind them that may be what you believe about yourself, and that's not how I've experienced you in community, in this group, in our time together.
Mhm.
Because again, experience and being reminded of different experiences is incredibly helpful.
Yeah. Okay, I'm working on separating my worth and value from how much I accomplish. That makes me think of this the idea of the blessing that Mark and Debbie write about in the Seven Desires book. That I separate from anything I do, I have worth and value.
Mhm.
And many of us have received affirmation or lack of affirmation that has caused us to need to produce,
Right.
accomplish, produce, maybe be a workaholic. And that's what brings my worth and value to me, rather than coming to this quiet, peaceful kind of knowledge or assurance that God created me with worth and value.
And I don't know if you would say this about the women. One of the things I see pretty consistently in the men who come through Faithful and True is that they struggle with an approval addiction, a performance addiction. And it's very much like what you're saying, that their value, their identity, and their safety comes from their performance or their behavior.
Mhm.
And so they're constantly striving to be successful, however they define that. And it is about them having a sense of value and them having a sense of safety. If I can just accomplish or achieve enough, then I can be loved, I can be chosen, I can be included.
Yeah. No, I think it's not gender specific, Greg.
Yeah,
I
I
think
agree.
I think we all as human beings learn that I accomplish and therefore I'm worth more.
Yeah. One
Yeah.
one of the things in the research that I did, I sought to evaluate was what I refer to as a performance-based faith. And one of the key components of a performance based faith is that righteousness is associated with my behavior versus righteousness being about who God is, that God is the one that is righteous. And any righteousness that I have doesn't come from me and my choices, comes from who God is and God's presence in my life.
Hmm.
Well, if I believe that I can perform and become righteous, now I've got this theological component operating. So it's not just some sort of cultural approval that I'm looking for, but I'm working really hard in order to get God's approval. And even though the church may be talking about grace, the way that I experience the church, it's actually more of an invitation of work harder, perform more, um, be good. Those are the things that are going to be able to save me. I think that that's one of the reasons in our population we see so many people struggling with this is that they grew up in churches that were reinforcing this performance-based identity.
Hmm. It's exhausting, isn't it?
It is.
And
I often
the
say that performance, when we have a performance-based identity, it is exhausting because you can
yeah.
always work harder and perform more.
Hmm. So that leads me to self-care. I'm learning that self-care is much more than the traditional things we think about of getting a massage or getting your nails done or whatever the men like to do. But that self-care is really uh, hard to define. I mean, it's hard to put limits on. That it's naming. It's very related to naming our needs, right?
Hmm.
And 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 a lot of us coming to believe that self-care is not selfish, that paying attention to how I feel and then what need that leads me to is healthy rather than being selfish or self-centered.
Absolutely. Well, and the way I talk about recovery is when I've identified my legitimate needs and I'm meeting them legitimately. That is self-care. And very much like you said, I can't do self-care if I don't know what my needs are. And so, using our language, the wise adult identifies their needs and meets those needs in a legitimate way, which allows them to function and serve and be able to live fully as God intended. I often would use the example of my car, where I could say to my car, you are selfish because you need oil. And because you need oil, you're selfish, and I'm not going to give you oil. Well, that's just foolish, because the people who designed the car designed it in a way that it needs oil. So when the oil light goes off, I need to pay attention to that and say, okay, here is a legitimate need based upon the way the car was designed. I need to pay attention to this. Well, we have certain needs that we have based upon the way that God designed us and created us. And if we ignore the warning lights, ultimately it's going to create more chaos. But if we pay attention to our needs and meet the needs legitimately, we're going to get a lot more mileage.
Very good. Very good.
the king of the analogy.
All right. I'm becoming more congruent or authentic in my choices, allowing my decisions to be made based on feelings and needs. Again, we're having a theme here of feelings and needs, and trying to quiet the shoulds. I think a lot of us have unknowingly lived with a lot of shoulds.
Well, and the motivation of obligation is one of the most destructive motivators. And I think a lot of people, and I can put myself in that category, we make choices based upon what we feel obligated to do. And one of the ways that we can know that we're operating out of that place of obligation is it leads to resentment. So if I'm doing things and the back end cost is resentment, that's a good indication that my motivation is obligation.
And sometimes this could be motivated just by safety too, right, Greg? I've learned that it becomes that I'm a lot safer if I read the room, I check out what's going to make somebody else happy, and then I decide to do that. Then I'm safe. And
what if we add a word?
Okay.
The word is, I perceive myself as more safe.
Okay, that's good.
And the reason I think that is important is, again, if I'm operating out of obligation, so I go in, I read the room, I determine what the room wants from me, and then I give them that, then temporarily I may appear to be safe, I may perceive myself as safe, but when I'm operating outside of myself, ultimately it's not going to lead to safety. Truth is what creates safety. And so performance, obligation, it is like a temporary thing, where in this moment I get to feel safe, but on the back end, it comes at a great cost.
I like that. I like that reframe, Greg. I think that's one of the things that I see the women discover in group, that they've learned to pay, and it was true of me, pay so much attention to what others need of me. And the equation didn't include me.
Right.
The first.
Well, and part of it too is, you again using our language here, if I'm in my wise adult, then I have the ability to serve others. If I'm in my survivor, it's not service, it's placating. And placating always leads to resentment, because I'm doing it for the other person, expecting something back from them. So I read the room, I determine what they want from me, I give that to them, but my expectation is, in return, I will get included, I will get chosen, I will get to be safe. And if I don't, it's kind of like I'm giving to get, and if I don't get back what I thought I would get, then it naturally leads to me resenting the situation. But I'm the one that tries to pickpocket from others without asking for my needs.
Correct. All right. Well, this next cluster here is about hoops, and people who've listened to a lot of our podcasts know what we mean when we talk about the hoops. 3 hoops, each individual, and a couple's hoop. I'm learning about my own hoop, and I'm trying to figure out how to spend more time in my hoop. Another way to say that would be I'm learning to know myself better. I'm learning to understand myself better. And that is surprisingly not often true of us when we
Absolutely.
begin this.
One of our survival strategies, one of the ways that we do create safety as children is through detachment and disassociation. And so it really is a skill that we have to learn. And we might call it self-awareness, we might call it self-attunement, but I'm actually growing in my capacity to be present with my internal world, my authentic self. And I'm literally getting to know what is true about me versus what I've been taught about me, kind of what we talked about earlier, some of those false core beliefs that I believe. I'm learning about who I am apart from other people's impressions of me. And I'm being honest with myself and others about what I'm doing at self-discovery.
Right. And so related to the hoops, I'm also identifying my unhealthy coping, which habits and trying to do better self-care instead. So we talk about the unhealthy coping being the things that we step outside of our hoop to do. They're often not as conscious, right? They're maybe habitual. They're things that have created order and chaos often in our stories, and they often are disconnecting us from ourselves.
And I think that this is one of those places where community is incredibly helpful, because if I'm just living with myself and maybe just going to a therapist, I may be challenged about stuff, but it may feel too frontal. It may be coming at me directly, and so I immediately become defensive. But if I'm in community and I hear other people talking about how they use TV to cope or spending to cope or how they're coping with food, I'm actually maybe more open or receptive to hearing other people that I can identify with versus directly being challenged myself about something. And so even the idea of growing in my awareness of how I self-medicate and cope, I can benefit from hearing other people talk about it first, and then to begin open to the possibility that that might be true for me too.
Yeah, that's good. And I think this might be confusing to people because coping is often talked about as a positive thing. And so we think self-care is a positive thing, and we're using coping as the medicating behaviors that we use. We hear a lot about healthy coping strategies out there in the world. So just clarify that.
And I'm very glad that you said that, because that, I think that is a very good point, is that for us, anytime we're medicating to exit ourselves, that is unhealthy. That's not going to serve us. What can be true, though, is we have some strategies where temporarily we step outside of ourselves, almost to get some relief from the chaos and the pain. And so it's the difference between spending hours, binge watching TV with no intention to ever return to myself, versus for an hour, I'm going to watch my favorite show, knowing that when that show is over, all that is true about my life and my circumstances will still be true, and I can return to it. It's that intentional piece where I'm stepping outside of myself for the purpose of returning versus I'm exiting myself, never wanting to have to come back to the chaos.
Good clarification.
Okay. Well, we have time for one more. So is there one more that you can share?
I will choose, I'm identifying healthy ways to take space for myself and name my limits. Say things speak what I cannot manage.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the idea that no can be a complete sentence. I can take space for myself. I can step away. I can disengage when I need to in healthy ways.
And we talked about many people perceive self-care as being selfish. Another message can be to use your no or steward your no. That is also selfish. That it's as if we've lost a right to have our no. But the reality is, the scripture says that we need our yes and we need our no. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. And part of that is naming our limits. I'm going to say yes to this because I have the capacity, the skill set, the energy to do it. And I'm going to say no to this because it's beyond my limits and I'm not serving anybody if I'm operating outside of my limits and my capacity. And so this is just part of healthy living, to have my yes and have my no. And it's not me being selfish.
And this can be some core belief work too, right, Greg? Because
Mhm.
we might have a core belief that it's not okay for us to do that. And so part of our work might be learning that I get to give myself permission to do this.
Absolutely. Well, and a great question to ask is, growing up, how did I hear my parents, my family, how did we talk about yes and no? What did we say yes to? What did we say no to? Because that's the foundation of where I begin to learn what my limits. Did I grow up in a home where I saw my parents easily name their limits and say no to things? Or was it over functioning? Was it over giving? Was it operating outside of the capacity? Was the schedule always too full? That's where some of the messages about yes and no can easily be learned as children.
True, true. Well, we
Well,
got
Susie,
through
we
maybe 2/3 of the page.
Well, then that's a
Blitzed
great
right through.
opportunity to come back at
yeah.
some point.
Well, and here's the good news: is our listeners, who I'm sure are really enjoying this podcast, are welcome to click on the link that is tied to the podcast here, where they will find the opportunity to download your article that includes this whole list that you've been going from today. So click on the link to access Susie's list. And we just can't thank you enough, Susie, for being with us today. This has been a great conversation, and we really appreciate you taking the time. We also want to invite our listeners and our viewers that if you find yourself struggling with many of these issues, and if you're a man struggling with sexual addiction or pornography addiction or any unwanted sexual behaviors, we invite you to visit faithfulandtrue.com. Click on the men's journey workshop, because we offer that event every month. And if you were to meet with any of our therapists, they're going to make that a number one recommendation for you to really jumpstart your healing journey. Now, we also have on a 3 or 4 times a year, we do the Women's Journey Workshop, which is another powerful event for the wives. And we also do the Couples Journey Workshop. So check out all those details. There's lots to read about. The website is filled with free resources like blogs and podcasts like this. And we would just like to offer all of those to you. So Susie, thanks again for being with us today. We look forward to having you come back again. Maybe we'll jumpstart this conversation and get to the rest of your list, which has been really very enjoyable. So until then, we hope that this coming week is going to be a week for you that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.